Hello, everybody, and welcome in to the Autzen Audibles podcast. I am your host, Jared Mack, and with me, as always, is colleague and friend Erik Skopil. Erik, how are we doing today?
I've got a little bit of a cough syrup brain, so I hope I hold up.
Good.
Yeah,
Bill Simmons, nice.
the best. Yeah, and then I have to try to do my best here on a kind of a little bit on the mend with the cough, but otherwise can't complain. Weather in the Willamette Valley is great today, strangely, and we've got a great football game to preview here in a couple of days. So I'm excited to talk a little Illini.
Fighting Illini, nonetheless. Very excited for this upcoming matchup. For those who don't know, maybe just randomly want to listen to an Oregon podcast. Oregon, number 1 Oregon, takes on number 20 Illinois this weekend, starting at 12:30 Pacific, 3:30 Eastern time on CBS. That's right, CBS. I don't remember the last time Oregon was on CBS. It has to have been, it's got to be like decades at this point, right?
Yeah, I can't think of a time because the CBS has been an SEC broadcast station, and Oregon doesn't really play in that conference. So
no,
I
surprisingly, yeah.
I can't. I was talking with James Krepke today about, I don't know if Gary Danielson, who's calling this game with Brad Nessler, has ever called an Oregon game, which is crazy because these have been kind of two of the marquee broadcasters or one of the marquee teams for forever. So yeah, exciting.
Yeah, no, very excited. I'll be able to rewatch the game, but for those watching the game who aren't at Autzen Stadium, let us know how it is. Send us a couple tweets, whatever. Drop it in the replies of our podcast post game because I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be interesting. But that's not why we're here to discuss commentators of football games. Although we could go, I'm sure, for a long time on our thoughts on people who cover Oregon games, like Tim Brando last week. But
oh boy,
I digress.
We're here. Let's not go there.
So this is the Wednesday edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast, which means we're here to talk injuries, updates on availabilities of players, and then kind of break down from our point of view what's going on with this upcoming matchup between Oregon and Illinois. We will start by saying that their practice was not made public this week, or public meaning to the media this week. So normally on a normal week, we get to go into practices on Tuesday and Wednesday after Dan Lanning's Monday night press conference, watch a little bit of stretching, watch a little bit of plays, and then we leave. But in that timeline, we get an idea of players who are hurt, not at practice, take attendance. It's kind of the only real big information we get out of going to these practices. So for those of you who don't know what goes on a normal Monday, Tuesday, this was not a normal Monday, Tuesday. Tuesday, Wednesday. Apologies. This was no practice, no nothing. We just had media interviews post practice on Tuesday, Wednesday, including today when we talked to Dan. So not a whole lot. I don't think this will take, we won't have 35 minutes on Matthew Bedford's availability. So I'm sorry, everybody listening who was really into that.
They wanted that. Did you not read the comments? That was
I read them every once in a while.
In September, everybody was just dying for more Bedford talk. They wanted all of it.
Yeah, no, none of that. I think the biggest key information that we got this week out of the availability injury stuff was Dan Lanning mentioned that Trayshawn Holden will be available this week to play against Illinois. He did not further comment on it, whether that's he'll play the first half, he'll only play the second half. We're not sure there, but the fact that he is available is good news for Oregon, I think. One of the best perimeter blockers, obviously the number 3 wide receiver, but still very talented in his own right. So I think that's the biggest piece of information that we have going into this game, considering we didn't see anything at practice. There's still some big question marks around who could be playing. But we know for sure that Trayshawn Holden will be available.
I took available, and maybe I'll be wrong because I'm still not great at reading Dan's quotes at this point sometimes, but I took that as he's going to play the whole thing. Now we'll see on Saturday, but that was just how I took it, and it could be totally wrong. What I will be curious on the Trayshawn front is Dan talked about Justice kind of having a larger role or growing role in this offense. I'm just curious on what the balance is for those two with snaps. I mean, we know Tez and Evan are at this point the alphas at receiver. Or Trayshawn and Justice, and maybe a little more of a timeshare than obviously prior to the spitting incident. And Trayshawn was playing 85+% of that. I know it's still sad that that's what we're talking about. We haven't addressed the fact he was out for a game and a half because he spat on another player, which is just gross and
spitting
weird.
incident.
Terrible moment for him. And obviously he feels awful, as he should. But I'll just be curious. Like, does Justice have still a little bit more of an involvement this week or going forward? Does Trayshawn go back to playing basically all of the Z receiver snaps? That kind of breakdown is kind of something we don't know, because I thought Justice equipped himself very well in the 1.5 games he played, almost exclusively here with Trayshawn out. So that'll be the one thing I'm watching for. But I do still think Trayshawn is going to be a fixture in this offense, obviously. And as you said, one of the better perimeter blockers, a guy who can house any of the underneath. I mean, he took a slant against, I think, Boise State home. He took a couple of those last year, as you remember. He's had a couple of other explosives. So this is definitely a valuable part of the offense. And I think it's significant, especially when you think about, we don't know what's going to happen with Terrence Ferguson. He's one of those injured guys that we don't have a lot of information on, but I think it's probably likely he doesn't play this week. Could be totally wrong. Maybe I'll be surprised on Saturday. Again, we have not been able to watch practice, and Dan's comments on injured players was kind of ambiguous. I guess.
Word salad, yeah.
I don't know. Like, we just not much to take from it. We will see. But Trayshawn being back, I think, is certainly significant, considering what we don't know with Terrence.
Yeah, 100%. Just gives another pass catcher. Oregon obviously did fine last week with Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson, and the relative emergence of Kenyon Sadiq, who had a really good 30-whatever+ yard play. But it just gives you more comfort. I think that if Trayshawn's going to go, I think Justice Lowe's role is going to just be what it was before. Just like, 10, 15, maybe 20 snaps a game, barring injury to anybody else. But just because I think Trayshawn is the superior player by all means.
100%.
Blocking,
100%.
Receiving, all the other stuff that a wide receiver does. So I think it'll be that 3, 4, 5-man rotation that we've seen the last couple of weeks, with really no changes. If Trayshawn plays the whole game, and I have the same kind of understanding of Dan's comment as you did, Eric. Like, I think he'll be a starter. I think he'll just go into the role that he was like going into the Ohio State game. I don't really think that changes. So
yeah.
I think that's the most important thing. But Dan did say stuff about Terrence Ferguson, Jordan Burch, and Matthew Bedford. It was a word salad. It was just like, as the season goes on and the week goes on, like, we'll see when these guys are available. So nothing there. Gary Bryant, kind of the same thing, where we'll just find out eventually. I don't think we need to really go dive into that.
Nope.
So I don't have anything else in terms of this section of the podcast. Do you?
The only thing I had left was that we at least know Terrence is around the team because Dylan Gabriel told us, and the two best friends drove into practice together on Tuesday, according to Dylan, and he hates it for Terrence. He's the only one, by the way. The only reason I'm talking about this, he's the only one that's really gone into any detail on Terrence, other than that he had his appendix removed. So it was good hearing from Dylan some insights into what's going on with Terrence, like how he's handling it well, but still really unclear of what's going to happen. We know and it's not a surprise. We know he's been around the team this week, which is obviously encouraging.
Yeah. And I don't expect to see him play. And I don't either. I think that's okay. I think there are some concerns with the tight end room, at least from my perspective, in terms of their blocking overall, and relying heavily on Kenyon Sadiq and Roger Saliapaga, who are not necessarily the bigger bruiser guys that Oregon has had in the past. But I think that's more of a conversation for tomorrow's prediction podcast in terms of what we see from the game. But let's jump in to the number 20 ranked Fighting Illini, Illinois Fighting Illini, 6-1 on the season, 3-1 in the conference in the Big Ten. Their only loss came to Penn State, which I believe they lost 21-7, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. Go me. That is the score of which Illinois won this past weekend against Michigan at home. Big win for Illinois, just as a program, to beat Michigan. I think obviously Michigan isn't as good as they were last year, or nowhere close to that. But regardless, you're still beating Michigan. So that was a big win for them and head coach Brett Bielema. So, I mean, do you want to start offense? Do you want to start defense?
I just think let's start offense, but just like broadly, this is a really sound football team. Like they're like just like a really competent, capable football team. They don't make mistakes. I was just looking before we jumped on here. They're second in the Big Ten in turnover margin, I think 13th nationally. They force a lot of turnovers. They don't give it away much. Luke Altmaier has thrown one interception. That's their quarterback, who is excellent and has played really, really well this season. Especially in the big moments. So this is a team that's like not going to beat itself. Like this is probably a kind of a faulty analogy, but like kind of reminds me of when Oregon used to play like Big Ten basketball teams like a decade ago, where you'd play Wisconsin and it would be like, well, Oregon might have the better athletes, which is the case, I think, on Saturday. I think Oregon's faster and more explosive than Illinois, but Illinois is not going to beat itself. They're going to be really well coached. They're going to run what they run and run it well. And so if you're Oregon, you just have to, like, there are certain weeks where you go in and go like, oh, Aiden Childs is Michigan State's quarterback. He's going to make 3 to 5 mistakes that create separation here. For Oregon to create separation, they're going to have to do it on their own, I think, because I don't think this is an Illinois team that will, quote unquote, beat itself. So that's just kind of like the broad picture thoughts I've had on this team, having actually watched quite a bit of them play, and then also kind of looking into the numbers. Like, very sound. Brett Bielema knows what he's doing. He's been successful everywhere he's been. He's been successful, frankly, everywhere he's been with lesser talent, right? Going against more talented teams. So this is certainly a team that is playing above what people's expectations were. I did not think this was going to be one of the tougher games on the schedule. In Big Ten play, we might come out of this season saying this was the second best team Oregon played in Big Ten play, right? Ohio State and Illinois. And that might be what we end up saying. I don't know if the back end, we'll see, but that's the type of team they've been this year. And frankly, I expect this to be a rather competitive game, because this is an Illinois program that has kind of been not a very competitive team for a while, but they feel like they've figured something out, and there just seems like there's kind of a bit of a mystique here. And so we'll see what Oregon can do and what they can change it. But I think this is obviously an Illinois team coming with a lot of confidence. So do you have other thoughts broadly on them, or should we just jump into one side of the ball?
I think my one broad thought is this is a very similar team to Oregon. And it's not that they're the same talent level or anything, but when you watch Illinois play offense or defense, it looks rather similar to what Oregon does. Illinois' offensive coordinator comes from UTSA. He was there at the same time as Will Stein. It's a very kind of point and shoot offense where it's going to be high completion percentages. Like, Altmaier's hitting at almost 66% of his passes this year, 15 touchdowns, 1 interception. Doesn't put the ball in jeopardy that much, although PFF would have you think differently, considering he has 9 big-time throws, PFF's usage, not mine, and 9 turnover-worthy plays. So we'll see. His 1 interception did come against Penn State, and now I'm just like diving into one specific side of the ball, but I'll go back for a second.
Yeah, that's fine.
Defense looks kind of similar to Oregon. They're willing to adapt whatever the case is. Like against Purdue, they were kind of sitting more 4-2-5 defense, which is what Oregon primarily runs with 5 defensive backs. But against Michigan, a team that's more run heavy, they played really like a 5-2-4, where they had 3 down linemen, 2 outside linebackers, 2 middle linebackers, and then the 4 defensive backs. And that's kind of what Oregon has done this season, where, against Boise State, they did that. Against Oregon State, they did that, where they were willing to adapt and drop their 4-2-5. They'll go play 5-2-4. I think Illinois is predominantly like a 3-4, like a base 3-4, but they're multiple. So they'll always have 3 down linemen no matter what. It'll just be interesting to see how they adapt to what Oregon does, because Oregon, unlike Michigan and kind of unlike Purdue, they're multiple on offense. They can go and do whatever they want. It's like, oh, you're going to put 3 down linemen and 4 up? Like, well, we're just going to run the ball. It's like, oh, you're going to put 5 down? It's like, cool, we're just going to throw the ball deep and go past your secondary. So I'm interested to see that. But that's kind of like my broad overview in terms of watching some tape and watching their games the last couple of weeks when they played Michigan, Purdue, and then at Penn State. Altmaier specifically kind of reminds me of what Ryan Brown looked like against Illinois, like a guy who can make some plays with his arm. It's quick around the edges. Oregon's going to have to do a good job kind of keeping him in that cage, which is what Oregon refers it to. And honestly, making tackles in the backfield. That's been a kind of a problem with Oregon and their interior defensive front, and Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon. For as good as they have been, it's kind of like the Brandon Dorless effect, where they get into the backfield They're right there, and it's obviously very hard to bring down an athlete like Luke Altmaier, Ryan Brown, or Aiden Childs a couple times against Michigan State. And they get into the backfield and they go too far, and Altmaier, whoever it is going to take off and maybe go run for a couple yards, maybe throw the ball. So I think for the interior defensive line for Oregon, they're gonna have opportunities to bring down Luke Altmaier. I'll get to that in a second, but overall, I think Altmaier is a solid quarterback. I think he should be respected by Oregon fans. I think you should come into the game with the same mindset of what I said last week, where it's like there will be moments where Altmaier breaks free and runs for a first down, and you gotta accept it because he's quick. He's not a running quarterback, but he can get out and run. Kind of similar to what Dylan Gabriel can do.
He's a gamer. I've really enjoyed watching him. And this is a really weird comparison, Jared, and you might not like it. Kind of reminds me of Kenny Pickett a couple of years ago, just in terms of the body type and the athleticism and the ability to make a certain kind of throw. I don't know. When I watched him, I just think physically there's some resemblances there. You clearly you're not sold.
29-year-old Kenny Pickett.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm just saying a couple of years ago, college Kenny Pickett, obviously Luke's he's a junior, so he's a little younger, but just physically, I don't know. I've kind of seen some similarities in terms of their body types, I guess, and sort of how they carry themselves. But yeah, and again, the key thing for me there is one interception this season came in Penn State. That's the one game, by the way, all year they've lost their turnover battle. They were -2 that game. On the season, they're like +8, +7, I forget, something like that.
I think it's +8, yeah.
They've been really good in that department. And I think that, to me, feels crucial in this matchup. +7. That feels crucial in this matchup is the turnover battle, because I think if this is a game where the turnover battle is even, Oregon will win fairly comfortably, I should say. I think this is a game where the turnover battle favors Illinois. I think we could be in for a dogfight and maybe an upset. And I think this is a game where it favors Oregon. It could get kind of ugly, because I don't see this necessarily being a team that can, if they're down 14 points and they give Oregon a bunch of opportunities, I just don't know if they'll be able to I guess, overcome that. So I think that part's interesting. I think talking about the defense, I will be curious, because I just saw this stat over on PFF. Illinois runs man coverage 6th most in the country this year in terms of just frequency. Oregon's got some real speed on the outside, and I'm just curious to how much they're going to want to do that. Like, if you watch what Oregon did, obviously, against Ohio State couple weeks ago, and the way they gashed a couple of guys that are seen as higher, more highly regarded players, I guess. I'd just be curious to see, like, does Illinois want to stick with that? Do they feel comfortable with keeping those guys kind of on an island? What kind of safety help can they get? You know what I mean? Just like, what's their comfort level of being like, hey, we're just going to play Evan and Tez and Trayshawn kind of man up and hope for the best? Because I think that's something that I'm sure they watched on tape against Ohio State, and when Ohio State thought they could do that a fair amount too, and it bit them a little bit. So that'll be something I'll be watching, because I do think there's a pretty decided speed advantage. Maybe not as much receiver secondary, although Oregon clearly has an advantage, but especially at like linebacker for Illinois. Like, I don't think they're a very fast team, and I just
very fleet of foot. Yeah,
they aren't, and you saw it against Purdue with Brown running away from guys throughout that game, and with their tight end doing kind of whatever he wanted in the second half. So that's kind of where my head's at on that side of the ball. Is I just wonder how much Oregon's speed and its dynamic, how dynamic they are, gives Illinois problems, and if that's the case, do they have a counter to that? Because part of me wonders, like, if Oregon can hit a couple explosives early here, force Illinois to kind of change what it's doing defensively, get out of, as you said, kind of putting, 5 guys at the line of scrimmage, and then Oregon can kind of run the ball on them and kind of pull away late. Like, that's kind of where my head's at. So I will be curious to see how, I guess, Illinois tries to negate Oregon's advantage in terms of the speed part. Because I do think, just watching these two teams, Oregon is very fast. I would say Illinois is probably pretty, middle of the road in terms of speed, athleticism.
Yeah, and that kind of shows up when you watch Illinois and their performances against Michigan and Penn State, who are two of the better defensive teams in the country. And again, Michigan is not what they were a year ago, but their defense is still really, really good. And again, a lot of people watch that Texas game where Quinn Ewers kind of diced them up. The problem with Michigan's defense is that they're on the field all the damn time because their offense can't do anything. So you look at those games, you look at the numbers, like against Penn State, 219 total yards, against Michigan, 267 total yards from Illinois' offense.
Mhm.
Altmaier had a combined 265 yards in those two games. He only completed 47% of his passes against Michigan. Like, those are situations where Penn State and Michigan have the superior athletes on defense.
Yes.
And what I'm most interested to see is how will Illinois' offensive line hold Oregon's defensive pressure? Because it's not a great offensive line, if I'm being frank. So sorry, I got to bring back up the pressures allowed here from PFF, which is one of the few things that I really like about what PFF has.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So on the season, they've allowed 65 pressures, but 26 of them have come from the right side of the offensive line. And they are in flux in terms of their right guard situation. They have Brandon Henderson and Zy Chrysler. Not sure how to pronounce it. However, still a really nice name. Those two guys have played in every single game this year. I think Henderson was starting last week. Yeah, against Michigan. He started the last 2 weeks. Last week, he had a 32.8 pass blocking grade against Michigan with 3 pressures allowed. And Chrysler wasn't much better with 2 pressures allowed and only 24 snaps. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch because while this team, Illinois specifically, doesn't turn the ball over a lot, they only have 6 in the season, 5 of them fumbles. Like we said, Altmaier only has the 1 interception against Penn State. They do allow a lot of pressures. They do allow a lot of tackles for loss. So that's something that I'm going to be really watching for from Illinois' offensive front. Because, again, if they can block, then they have 2 really good receivers on the outside, Bryant and Zachary Franklin, another guy from UTSA who was under Will Stein during his final year there and I think he had over 1,000 yards in his final season with Will Stein. Like, that's a talented individual. And that's a lot of their offense is getting those guys the ball, shocker. Very similar to what Oregon does. It's like, hey, get your playmakers in space. But that goes back to how I think this Illinois team kind of runs its offense like Oregon does. But Brian and Franklin are 2 guys who can certainly take the top off of defense. I think Brian has 7 of the 15 passing touchdowns this year.
Yeah.
So He's a playmaker. He's a real dude. Both he and Franklin are. But that's when Altmaier has time to throw. And if you look at Oregon, obviously I don't expect Jordan Birch to play, but even in the absence of Jordan Birch, Mateo Uyunglele has taken a step up. He's been awesome. Derek Carman's been great the entire season. Jamari Caldwell's been great the entire season. Amari Washington has come in and done a lot of good things as well. Tatum Tuioti, another guy that I could just start naming people on the team. But that's going to be a problem for Altmaier if he just can't get a pass off. And Oregon's secondary, as we know, is really, really good, and their linebackers are fast. So I'm kind of looking at how Illinois specifically performed against Penn State and Michigan and just putting that in the back of my head. When it's like, hey, when they play really good defenses, they're not that great in terms of moving the ball down the field. So I'm just thinking about it. I think overall it's a really talented offense, but offensive line struggles can get you in a lot of problems really fast, as we saw from Oregon during the first 2 games of the season. So my 2 cents.
I think that's right in terms of how they've performed against better defenses. 7 points is against Penn State, 21 obviously against Michigan. The receivers, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, they forced 3 turnovers against Michigan. Like, they had 21 points the entire game, even with 3 extra drives. So it's not like they were just moving the ball down the field at will. Like, they had some big shots, they had some bigger throws, but they did not orchestrate their offense how they did, the week prior against Purdue where they had 556 yards.
And one thing you can acknowledge there is Penn State and Michigan's defensive fronts are really, really good. Michigan in particular in the interior is really dominant. And Penn State's got some real athletes on the outside, which seems like they do every year. So that will be, to me, a focal point. I think the bigger one is the part you touched on with the receivers. I think this is probably the second best receiving duo Oregon will play this year. Ohio State's impossible to beat, essentially, but I don't think. Maybe Washington in the last game of the season, just the way that
maybe, yeah. Denzel Boston's been really
Denzel
good.
Boston's been awesome. He's leading the Big Ten.
Ooh.
That's the first one I've had in forever.
Lippage.
I know.
Yeah.
Years and years, but he has 9 touchdowns this year. Boston does. But they're really, they're interesting in terms of the way they attack the field. Just looking at their receptions chart, this is undoubtedly Bryant's going to be the guy trying to take the top off down the field. Kobe Savage talked a little bit about that today when we spoke with him, of just their willingness to throw it down the field, their desire to do that. I think maybe only Michigan State, in terms of teams Oregon has faced, has tried it with that kind of frequency. And Bryant's been awesome in contested catches and in success rate down the field. So that's part of it. And the Franklin's really good in intermediate as kind of not a real, I don't know. It's kind of like the Mike Evans, Chris Godwin combination a little bit there, where it's like one guy's the guy you're looking for down the field. The other guy's going to be really reliable and do a little bit after the catch underneath. So that's kind of the combination you've got there.
Which is, again, kind of like Oregon's.
Which is kind of like Oregon. Yeah, true. I mean, there are some similarities. And I guess just the part that I would have been more concerned about if not for the Ohio State game, not to say Oregon's corners were just electrifying and didn't get beaten, but the size of Pat Bryant at 6'3" would make me a little bit more nervous if I hadn't seen Oregon's corners fare pretty well against bigger receivers this year. But that's something that's kind of still in my back of my head, of just Oregon's going to play this full season basically with none of its primary defensive backs being 6 feet tall or taller, right? They're 5'11", 5'10" guys exclusively. Does Bryant and his size cause some problems, his contested catch ability? That's something I'm kind of wary of. But to your point, it really will come down to the offensive line play. And I think the sneaky part here is Illinois' run game. And like, what can they get out of that with Caden Feagin out for the year now, Josh McCrary in, go from a 6'3", 250 back to a 6'1", 240 back. So still,
where did McCrary play before?
He's been Illinois the whole way. He just has been hurt. I thought he was a transfer too, because he's from the Southeast, I think, but he had like 500 and something yards as a freshman, and then he missed his sophomore and most of his second and third seasons with injury. So he is now back, but he's big. He's not overly explosive, but I think he's kind of one of those guys who over the course of the game can kind of wear on you. So if Illinois is able to develop a lead like they did against Michigan, he can cause some problems. So that would be something I'm wary of there, because I guess I would say I'm not super confident Illinois can run the ball with a great level of success. But I will also say we just watched them, even in a shutout against Purdue, allow the Boilermakers to run off tackle with quite a bit of success and to just establish a run game more than I had thought. So I think that part is important. If Oregon's able to bottle up that run game and make this a, hey, Luke, you have to go make a great play on 3rd and 7 or 3rd and 8 over and over again, I think Oregon's defense has been great in those sort of situations this year, and I feel confident about them getting off the field. But if they're able to run the ball and kind of move it that way and not just have to rely on Altmaier, that's where maybe this thing kind of gets a little bit closer than you expected.
Yeah, I misspoke earlier when I said the 24 pressures on the right side of the line. It's actually 25 from the left side of the line. I was looking at the wrong page. Left tackle, left guard, 25 combined pressures. So, and that kind of falls into the 3rd and long situations where, Oregon can put in their rabbits package and just kind of let them eat off the edge, whether it's Mateo on that side or Jaden Moore, a guy who's really just like a kind of a pass rush specialist at this point. Like that's why Purdue is able to run the ball, but once Oregon stopped him on 1st down and put him behind the sticks, like that's, they lost that game just every single time they did that. I was sitting in the press box, I'd lean over to Alec Dietz on the register guard, and I was like, well, it's 2nd and 11. Good luck. It's not going to work. Yep. So, yeah, I think it's certainly a good offense, but I think Oregon has the tools and the tricks to kind of neutralize them the way that Penn State and Michigan did. Anything else?
Actually, well, I had one question for you that I don't know if we discussed on or off, is what do we make of the Illinois-Purdue game? Just because it's such an outlier for this Illinois defense, which has been pretty solid against, like, 21 points against Penn State, 7 to Michigan. I know Michigan's offense is really bad. Purdue's offense is probably better than Michigan's offense, which Purdue has a much more competent quarterback, at least. But to go see them in consecutive weeks, to see Purdue score 49 albeit in overtime, against Illinois' defense, and then be shut out the subsequent week against Oregon's defense. I'm just like, what is that? And I hate trying to play compare this game against that game because they're different and all that. But like, it's hard not to when they've played in these are like their last two performances almost, and it's like such a big difference in terms of what they did week to week there. I'm talking about Purdue's offense against these two defenses.
It's tough. When I watched the Purdue and Illinois game, I just kept coming back to the point that Illinois' linebackers and defensive linemen were really slow.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of the perks for Oregon is that their linebacker core, most guys, or all of them are pretty fast. But when you have Devin Jackson and Jeff Boss on the field at the same time, they can go sideline to sideline with the best of them. And that didn't happen against Purdue for Illinois' defense. So I don't know really what to make of it. I mean, Ryan Brown, 379 yards, 3 touchdowns, like 100 yards on the ground. And then you look at him this week and he's like last week, against Oregon, he's a redshirt freshman making his second career start. Like, he looked bad and he didn't make any throws, and Oregon contained him in the pocket. So I don't know. It's tough. I put some stock into it, but I don't put a lot of stock into it because, again, it's like fresh off the OC change and the guy making his first career start. You don't have a lot of tape on him. So,
right. Yeah.
I don't know. But the thing that always just stood out was the difference in speed between Purdue and Illinois' defense. And we'll see if that becomes a factor on Saturday. I think it'll be pretty obvious at the very beginning of the game to see if there's like an even greater difference in speed levels between these two teams. But that's the one thing I keep coming back to. But I don't really know what to make of it either.
Yeah, and I kind of bring that up because I've seen people point to that for why, this Oregon's going to blow them out. If Purdue could score 49 points, what can Oregon do? And I just think Oregon
game was so stupid.
It was so bizarre. I actually watched that whole replay of that game and parts of it live because Oregon had the I think wasn't playing that day for whatever reason or something. But I just it's been kind of in the back of my head too of like that was such a weird outcome and how having played these two teams in consecutive weeks, like what does that say? But I just think with Illinois, this is a team you want to play with a lead because I think if you get a lead against them, I just don't necessarily think they're gonna have the punch and the firepower to come back. I say that while having a lot of respect for Luke Altmaier and these receivers and Brett Bielema in general is like I think a really great coach. And we should note like Dan doesn't usually go into that much detail for his appreciation for the opposing coach. Like his opening statement on Monday was like 30 seconds, 40 seconds on Brett and what he's accomplished and how much he's kind of admired him from far away. So clearly Dan has a lot of respect for Brett and what his teams do, but I just don't know if they necessarily have the firepower if Oregon can create a lead. So this feels like another one where you've got to get out to a strong start, take care of your business, build the lead. And if you do that, I don't know if Illinois on the road is going to have the dogs to make a big rally to come back.
We're going to take a break. And we're going to come back and talk about the defensive side of the ball for Illinois and what Oregon needs to do to win this game, basically. So take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right. We are back for the Autzen Audibles podcast. We just kind of dissected Illinois' offense and what they do well and what they struggle on. And now we're going to pull up the defensive side of the ball and see what Oregon needs to do there. I think first I want to start with the turnovers because Illinois has 13 of them on the season. I take that with a little grain of salt because 11 of them came in 3 games against Eastern Illinois, Kansas, and this past week against Michigan, where they forced 2 fumbles and 1 interception against the Wolverines. So it's certainly a team, Dan's talked about it all week long, where they are aggressive to the ball and they finish and they play every down with intensity. And they're trying to punch the ball out. Like this isn't a mistake that they had 2 forced fumbles against Michigan. Like they were going after the football. So I think that kind of favors Oregon because they don't fumble that often. Knock on wood here, but they're not a team that has been notorious for fumbling. I don't remember how many times they've done it this season. I think it's like technically 3 or 4 because they lose a fumble and then they jump back on it. But the one for Patrick Herbert against Boise State comes to mind. But I think overall, it's a defense that Oregon can exploit, and I think they can do it, frankly, with relative ease going into it.
Yeah, the fumbles lost. There were the 2 against Boise State, and there was the 1 against Idaho. No fumbles lost since. So that's actually, I didn't know if I really quite realized that they haven't lost the ball in a fumble in 5 games. This is, by the way, ball security has been a strength for Oregon under Dan Lanning over the course of his time here. I think it's still like 2 or 3 running back fumbles like in 3 seasons. I know they didn't have a single one in 2022, and it was like 1 or 2 last year. So that's been something they've been.
I know. I remember one very specifically against Utah, but
yeah,
I don't know if it happened again. If I'm being honest.
Yeah, so maybe it might just literally be like 1 lost turnover for running backs this year. So that part, you're right, is probably favorable for Oregon, but maybe this is a team that, because they have such a focus on it, it's able to force a couple, and that flips the game because that's unexpected and whatnot. But I know ball security is very well drilled here, and I'm sure will be a focal point. Is because, as you said, Jared, you watch them play. Like, this is not by accident. They aren't just walking into fumbles. They're creating them. I touched on the speed part, which I think really does favor Oregon. I think one thing that we talk about the success Oregon can have.
Yeah.
We talk about the sex. We have to on this podcast. We talk about
the
success Oregon has had with its speed on the outside and the vertical pass game. And we talked about on the other side of the ball of like it's important for Oregon's defense to maybe create some pressure, make it so Luke Altmaier's uncomfortable. Gabe Yakis for Illinois is about as disruptive of an edge guy as they'll play this year. Obviously, you've got the Ohio State guys. Michigan's got some interior players, but in terms of like guys that can really disrupt the game, this is one of those players. 13 tackles last year, 2.5 sacks last week against Michigan. Those are impressive stats. He's the reigning Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week for a reason, and he's going to be a player to absolutely know. Like if there's going to be a game record for this Illinois defense, that's the guy. And they'll move him around a little bit, but this is like a Josh Connerly special here. This is who he's going to be matched up with. And we've seen it in the past where he hasn't necessarily dominated. Like, wasn't this year necessarily, because I think he's played pretty well overall. But, you go back to a year ago against Washington, he had some trouble there, especially with some speed rush and stuff. And that's kind of what this guy will do. He'll bring some explosiveness off the edge. And I think that's one thing to kind of keep an eye on, because if, Dylan's been awesome for the most part this year, but the times where he has made mistakes is when he's kind of been sped up, been forced to try to maybe do a little too much and leave the pocket and throw the ball to areas of the field that maybe he can't fit into, or is a little bit too late because he's running around trying to find things, so that's the part that Illinois might be able to cause some issues for this Oregon offense. But I think it's as simple as like, if Dylan can get the ball to the right players in the right spots on the field, which he's been excellent at this year, I don't see Illinois having the athletes in space to really slow Oregon down. And this could be a game where like Oregon finds a matchup or two they really, really like. I think especially at linebacker, like maybe they just target that. Like, do they try to just get Tez matched up against certain personnel the whole game and just hit that over and over? Did they do this? Does Kenyon Sadiq have a game where they really go like, the speed of Illinois' linebackers is not great. Let's just try to feed him and see what they can do in space. And he has a big game. I could just see something like that happening, because I think there are some really talented players like in Illinois secondary. One of their outside corners, I think is it Xavier Scott? Yeah. His coverage grade is like on PFF is top 10 in the country. Like, this is one of the better corners Oregon will probably face. So there's that, but there's also some guys out there that I think Oregon can maybe take advantage of. And that'll be the part that'll be interesting to see what they do on Saturday. Because again, assuming you can get the ball out in space, I think Oregon's got a real edge with these, just with the speed and athleticism that they have.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you. If I were Illinois, I would not be playing man-to-man this week against Oregon.
That's the other part I said earlier. They run a lot of man. Can they do that this week? I'm not sure.
I think that's kind of like their bread and butter. Dan has always talked, or at least Dan has talked this week a lot about like Illinois teams this year and in the past have always played with an identity. I firmly believe that their identity is playing man-to-man defense. I think that they'll start out with that, and we'll see how that goes for the first couple drives potentially on Saturday. But Oregon has the clear speed advantage there with Tez, with Evan Stewart, and with Trayshawn Holden as long as he's playing the game. I think that can be a huge matchup thing. And if they throw Kenyon Sadiq out in the slot or outside like they've been doing recently, and I think that's where he should be playing, like you're going to have potentially a linebacker on him. And if you don't have a linebacker on him, you have a safety. Like that's bringing safety help down into the box to cover a tight end. And then all of a sudden, if Tez or Evan gets a step on somebody with how well Dylan is throwing the ball, that could be a big game. It could be a touchdown. It could be 30, 40, 50 yards down the field. So I think it's going to be a tough matchup for Illinois secondary. You mentioned Yakus. Coleman, their other outside linebacker, has 18 pressures this year. He's had 8 in the last 2 weeks. Against Michigan, I think he had 4, which is a pretty good Michigan offensive line. Again, it's not what it was last year, but it's still a solid offensive line in general. Like that's a concern going into it. Like you mentioned, that's been the problem for Oregon this year. Despite the fact that I thought they did a really good job against Ohio State.
They did.
Where
they did.
There were pressures, don't get me wrong, and Dylan had guys, rushing into his pocket, but I thought they did a good job against Ohio State. And I think one of the key things is I think Oregon's interior defensive line is going to be, or excuse me, interior offensive line is going to have an advantage against Illinois' interior defensive line. I don't think there's enough game records for Illinois in the very middle to really kind of pose a threat to if Oregon just wants to establish the run on the inside and run behind Harper or Poncho or Struther on the left guard. Like, I think that could be a real advantage for Oregon moving in this game, but we'll see. They kind of struggled last week against the bear front that Dan talked about after the game against Purdue. But if you're Illinois, like you saw what happened when Purdue ran it at a bear front when they put 5 guys at the line of scrimmage. Oregon just said, okay, cool. We'll go over the top.
Yep.
We'll take advantage of the secondary. And if Illinois comes out and plays like a bear front or 5 men down the box or 8 men down the box, I should say, that's fine. Oregon's going to take the top off or hit guys who are just faster than whoever's covering them. So I think the steps are there for Oregon to take this game over. It's just going to be execution and winning the turnover battle that we've talked about before.
I like that you brought up Oregon having the advantage perhaps in the interior, because I don't know how many weeks this season will say that, and that's not to take a shot at Oregon's interior line, but if there is a weakness on that offense, it's probably that, right? Like they've got incredible speed on the outside. They've got a really talented running back. Depth at running back is another thing I guess you could throw out there, but now we're getting kind of nitpicky. Quarterback who's been very, very consistent, very accurate, has I think kind of blown us away with his ability to throw the deep ball the last couple of weeks. Tight ends are very talented. Tackles are going to be Sunday players. The guards there, it's not always it's not quite the same level, I would say, of talent, or at least that's not my impression when I watch them. And if there's a game where you can go to the interior run game a little bit more, maybe that's this game, and that would be something that you could rely upon maybe more this week than in future weeks. Because I think against Michigan, we're not going to get too far down the road with that, but that could be a game where you really have to sort of change your game script, because Michigan does have absolute game records in the middle of that defense. That's not the issue this week, though. It's very different. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see, I guess, how this line matches up against Illinois and how they take advantage of it, because I do think there are a couple spots where Illinois can give them trouble, but as you said, kind of identify, there are a couple spots where Oregon really should be able to kind of flex and kind of show out.
Yeah, like Penn State ran for 239 yards against them, albeit on 44 carries, because we'll see if Drew Aller is that guy. Purdue ran for 239 yards against them. Kind of funny, back-to-back weeks, 239 yards. Don't worry now. Well, Ryan Brown ran for 118 yards against them, but that kind of just shows the ability to get out in space and take advantage of some potential speed matchups that favor an opposing team that has better athletes. They also allowed 178 yards on the ground to Kansas, who, while they've been kind of bad this year, they still have like some offensive potential. Again, despite their record, I just think it's an opportunity for Oregon to kind of take advantage in the run game. it hasn't been great this year overall, the run game. There's been some moments that it's been really good. But again, if you can set up the run, you can set up play actions, you can set up RPOs, you can set up fake pitches. If Dylan takes the ball on RPOs and starts putting that into the offense as well, like just more things for them to look at. But I think this ultimately just comes down to, can Oregon's tackles protect the pocket, give Dylan enough time? Because if he has enough time, I think that Stewart, Tez, and Trayshawn, Kenyon, all the other guys, I think will be able to eat.
My last thought here before we wrap is just talking this out. I feel like Oregon has to do less right to be successful in this game, if that makes sense. Like, as we're talking about it, here's my point. You're just right. Saying they have to. There are fewer items to connect on to have the sort of success they need to. Whereas Illinois is facing, I think, more places that maybe it's not a disadvantage, but it really feels like you have to execute. Because I look at Oregon and I go, I think they're going to be able to run the ball between the tackles. And as you just said, I think they're going to be able to throw the ball over the top. Now, it's a matter of, can they get protection? And so that's just kind of isolated on those matchups. And sometimes you go into a game and it's like as simple as those matchups end up being losses, and that changes the whole complexion. But I think if Oregon's tackles hold up, they'll be great. I think on the other side for Illinois, I'm not convinced they're going to be able to run the ball very consistently. And yep. I also have worries about their ability to protect their quarterback. I think Oregon's front is probably one of the more underrated ones. I think it's starting to get appreciated. But even without Jordan Birch, 3 sacks last week, 10 tackles for loss. The week before against Ohio State were at least pretty impactful. I know that the I guess disruption stats aren't quite as impressive, but I just look at, for Illinois to be able to have a bunch of offensive success, it feels like kind of everything kind of has to fall into place. Where for Oregon, I just feel like the floor for Oregon is maybe just a lot higher than it is for Illinois in this game. And it's going to take a lot for Illinois to reach that ceiling, to do what it needs to win, is kind of my point.
Yeah, 100%. That's the number 1 team in the country going against the number 20 team in the country. Mm-hmm. There's just one team is on paper significantly better than the other team. And I think the very last thing I'll say is Illinois has to travel to Autzen Stadium.
Yes.
It's going to be another ruckus environment. I don't think it'll be the same intensity as Ohio State, just because it's not as big of a matchup. But, regardless, Autzen is always a difficult environment to play in. And is Illinois Eastern time zone? I can never tell.
I'm the wrong guy to ask, man. I'm going to say yes. But I will quickly. You have spent a lot more time on the East Coast than I have. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
While you look that up,
Central Daylight. There you go.
Okay, it's a Central.
And Champaign.
To that point, I think one thing with the Autzen environment that I'm curious on, they had such a reputation game last time out against Ohio State, right? Like that was, people came away, like Josh Pate's out there saying, loudest stadium in the Big Ten. You have people come in and say, this is one of the craziest environments. We had the Ohio State beat writers being like, that was the loudest football game I've been to in 20 years or whatever, all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Now this game's, I know it's not prime time, but it's 12:30 on CBS, big audience. I have to imagine that after you've had a game where everyone was like, oh my God, Autzen's amazing, that Autzen's going to kind of show up and be maybe not quite Ohio State levels, but be really impressive and cause some issues for the Illini.
Yeah, 100%. Anything else?
I'm all out of stuff, man. I got to take some cough syrup. I'm going to start coughing here, man.
You're running low. All right, yeah. I got nothing else either. So that'll do it for us on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed, please leave a comment, leave a like, 5-star review on wherever you listen to your podcast is really helpful for us. We'll be back tomorrow for our game prediction podcast. And then after that, it'll be the post-game podcast, probably not from Autzen Stadium, probably from our humble abodes. Hopefully at a reasonable hour, considering it is a 12:30 kickoff on CBS Saturday, October 26th, number 1 Oregon against number 20 Illinois. So that's all for us. Thank you all for listening.
Talk to you later, folks.